Um, One of the considerations that we have to give to matters when we are looking at research is the consideration of ethics. Ethics are increasingly now more important in research than they have been at any other time. In the past, you could involve yourself in all kinds of research and you didn't have to give two hoots about ethical considerations. You didn't have to give any thought to them whatsoever. You go back a few years and you could do almost anything you wanted to do, tell people anything you liked, subject them to any kind of situation, no matter how invasive or embarrassing that might be, how it might reveal private activities, and you could get away with absolutely everything. These days, the whole issue of ethics has come very, very strongly to the fore, and you cannot now even look at the subject of research without a consideration of the ethics involved in that. So I want to explain to you or introduce you to the subject of ethics as far as they impact upon research. I want to explain to you how there is an ethical policy within this university, as there is within every other university in the country and probably every university in the world now, all rooted upon making sure that when you conduct research, you do it in an ethical way. Okay. So let's explain a little bit about that and what that means. So the first question is, quite understandably, what is ethics? What is it all about? What does it actually mean? Can we agree on terms? Why is it important? Why is it growing in significance in the research community? And the reason for that is because in many cases, the research project which you do, in fact, I would say, in my experience, in most cases, your research project, I'm not just talking about this unit here, I'm talking about the project which you will be doing when you finish this unit. Your research project will involve people. It's a rare project which just sort of has the student closeted away in a laboratory churning out results. It might be that you're like that, and you might have no impact on people at all, but that's unusual, and it certainly will probably not be the case when you are working out in the big wide world outside of the university. Almost certainly you'll come across people who will be impacted by what you have to do. If you are, for example, working for a company, or working alongside a company, or going into a company in order to do some research, automatically you will probably come across people, and the impact of your research may have impact upon those people. So you have to take that into account. How is it going to affect the people who you come across? This is the fundamental consideration really with ethics. How does it affect people? Ordinary people, people who are not experts in your field. How will you ensure that you handle them in the right way? How will you make sure that you do the right thing by them? Don't mislead them. So that means then that before you are allowed to start your project, you will have to show that you have considered the ethical issues involved. You will have to prove that that's the case, and the way in which this university does it is it gets you to complete an ethics checklist or an ethics form. Okay. And that ethics form contains the bare bones of what the university considers ethical or not ethical, and will flag things up. Let me just start off with some definitions, though. trying to make it very clear to you, because the word ethics might mean different things to different people, just as the word moral might mean different things to different people. Sometimes people think the word ethical means moral, and sometimes people think the word moral means the word ethical. The two things are interchangeable. They're often used that way, but that's not the case. You have to think of ethics and morals as slightly different and see which one we are going to be concerned with. Ethics essentially is a system which is imposed on you from outside, whereas morals are principles of behaviour which come from within, if you like. So the ethics are externally presented to you, often regulated by society at large, often in the form of laws, or even more importantly, by a professional body. So if you are a member of the British Computing Society, it has a set of ethical standards. If you're a member of the IEEE, that also has a set of ethical standards. If you are a member of the ACM, then that too has a set of ethical standards. These are codes of behaviour which you will not bring your profession into disrepute. Now, those ethical standards are not quite the same as what we're looking at with research ethics. There's professional ethics, research ethics, and there is personal moral positions as well. Personal principles of right and wrong based upon your character. Welcome.
So one could argue one is protocol, the other one is principle.
Yes, you could put it that way. Yeah, that's your protocol versus principle. Some people say that ethics is a science of morals, and morals is the practical outworking of ethics. I've put a slide down here which is probably not worth going into in such detail, but you can have access to it in case you wanted to pin down exactly the difference between ethics and morals. The important thing is this is an external system set by professional bodies who expect you to behave in certain ways if you're going to undertake research or become a member of a professional body. And these are therefore not up for negotiation by you. You just have to accept them or not be involved in that activity. Okay? They are, by their very nature, imposed upon you. And whereas the moral principles may be things which drive you personally to do the right thing in whatever circumstance you may find yourself. They're not imposed upon you, they're derived from within you. And you may find that in this area that moral principles sometimes conflict with ethical principles, therefore. You can see the difference between the two quite strongly that way. For example, a person can follow an ethical code without having any morals at all. They may have no morality, they may be amoral in their approach to life, but because they're members of a society or undertaking certain activities, they follow a strict ethical code. On the other hand, you may well find that people who have strong moral principles may be in conflict with their ethical principles. And this often leads to the situation where you have whistleblowers, for example. They're working within a system. They're not happy morally with what's taking place within that system. Although they're following all the ethical codes of that system, they're not happy with that personally, and therefore they become whistleblowers. They inform outsiders or the press or someone else of practices which are going on which they personally think are wrong. And there's therefore this conflict sometimes between the ethical principles of the organisation and the moral principles of the individual. And you often need to know where you stand on those kind of things, know the difference between the two. So I'm making that point fairly strongly, simply so that you hopefully won't find yourself in that kind of dilemma or position of having a conflict between ethics and morality. But there's some differences there. Any questions on that so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is ethics something static? Because why I ask that? From the first definition, for the definition, ethics is something that created by groups, and groups belong to society, but society changes through time. So something is it's now ethic. Maybe in another society it's not, or after 10 years it's not, or before 10 years goes. So yeah, it's not.
I was just going to say that both of those things are both subject to change. Ethics are subject to change, usually by committees
Mhm.
or by governments or something like that. When
Or,
they
or
enact
just
laws.
by nature. It's,
And yes, things evolve and things change. And sometimes things which were not so important 10 years ago or 20 years ago suddenly become important now.
Mhm.
And things which are important now may not be so important in 20 years' time. So an ethical code is one which evolves and changes. People also change their moral behaviour too, because sometimes they're convinced they should do this rather than do that. And then later on, for example, they may say, actually, I've changed my mind on that. You know, some people may think when they're young, I shouldn't be drinking or smoking or something like that. And it's bad for me to do that. And when they get old, then they think, well, don't see why not, I've changed my mind. So, yeah.
It's quite an interesting one because at the moment there's lots of media attention around this nutrient thing. And also but in those days, it was definitely. Everyone used to do it. Or they used to tap one of the colleagues on the behind or whatever, and it wasn't seen as anything bad. But now they're going back, putting the morals and ethics that we have now, going back and then placing the blame on them in the past. And I was wondering, well, how, in terms of ethics, how far back do you have to go to be ethically sound?
The answer to that is there is no answer to it. And it's simply because if you go back, say, to Victorian days, which is over 100 years ago, and they had very strong ethical issues, very hung up about all kinds of things, sexual things in particular. Victorians were very prudish in that respect. You come down the ages, though, and you find that you get to the 60s, and there was a lot of relaxation on moral codes, and drug taking became common, and sexual behaviour became more open in that kind of way. 70s and 80s were, again, much more open and less prescriptive in terms of a moral code. But as we come into the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, that cycle is going back around again, becoming much more, shall we say, Victorian in our approach, much more moralistic in our approach. What's the impact of that for us? The impact of that for us is that you need to recognise that morals do change, ethical codes do change, and you have to, if you're going to be a professional, adopt the ethical code of the day.
Okay.
And the ethical code of yesterday is no good, and the ethical code of what you think might come tomorrow is no good either. You have to go along with what you're doing today, otherwise you fall outside professionalism.
But if you have a pioneer idea which is not ethical in your time, but it could be really good for the good of the humanity in the future, should you stop the research?
This becomes a moral issue for you. This is where may be a conflict between the slow-moving ethical code externally imposed, which may be quite rigid and quite in one particular direction, and your feelings that you should be doing something else in another way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you set up this conflict between morals and ethics.
There's that drug at the moment they had it on the One Show, and apparently there's this miracle cure or something, and there are channel islands for cancer. They're saying it was some autism and stuff like that. It was a miracle cure. And people who were taking it in the Channel Islands, they were saying, no, this has worked for us. But it hasn't been through the same ethics checklist as all the other drugs that are manufactured.
Yeah.
So there's a big thing about it now, and I think they were trying to say to them that he was doing what he was doing was ethically wrong, but whether it was morally right, you don't know. And obviously he has to go through those testing to figure out whether it is actually the curable drug. But
I mean that's come back quite recently also in the issue of Ebola too, where you have untried drugs which you want to try out on people who will die or most likely die if you don't give them to them. But the ethical constraint said it should have gone through certain trials which take 2 or 3 years. And people say, but morally, that's unacceptable because these people will die almost anyway unless you give them the drugs. But they haven't gone through the ethical framework guideline things, and there's this conflict set up. I think in the end, the moral argument won out that at least give these people some kind of help, otherwise they get no chance at all.
That also protects the science.
So, yes,
Because people can use that as an excuse for charlatanism.
you can
Yes.
indeed, that's right. So, good point. I think the point is that there are many different and conflicting aims and reasons for different codes here. Sometimes a moral code can be a very selfish thing, whereas an ethical code can be a very social thing. Sometimes you're weighing up your personal opinions and views against what the social consequences might be.
But in terms of the law can only be applied to today and tomorrow. It can never apply to what has already happened.
well, it's weird. They're applying it to our standards to the old standards in a lot of the cases.
That's always a difficulty, I think, and when you try to translate today's moral or ethical stance and read it back into, say, the 60s, and you get these historical cases of child abuse you're talking about with Nutri, the question is then aroused, is that fair to view the past through the eyes of the present when things have changed so much?
But it was still illegal then. That's the whole point. It is illegal now and it was illegal then. That's why they can do it. Otherwise, the law cannot be applied to the past.
But there are some things which were not illegal, which were illegal then and not illegal now. Things do change, the law does change. And sometimes you ask, should the law be applied retrospectively or not?
No, it can. The law can only be applied to now and present. It can never be applied to the past.
Well, that's interesting. Let me give you one instance which has caused some controversy. Alan Turing, who probably many of us have heard of because of his work in computers, was homosexual in the 1950s, I think it was,
And prosecuted.
and prosecuted for that. These days, that's not an offence in law, so the law has changed between then and now. And I think that the government went ahead and pardoned him for the offence which he was prosecuted for back in the 50s. Now, there's a shift there. We're viewing now that particular law because he was a famous person and saying that he should be pardoned for an offence which was legitimate in those days, but not legitimate in these days. Now, the question is that an appropriate way in which you can retrospectively change essentially the law?
There's another one as well because there's a film called Dallas Buyers Club. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a really good film,
No.
and it's about in America there was AIDS drugs, and then this guy he contracted it, and the government at the time made a deal with one of the drug companies to supply only a certain drug, which was actually damaging and hurting them, making them.
It's the
Well,
biggest
time.
argument at the moment between India and USA. India wants to produce generic drugs.
Yeah.
USA says no.
No.
And that is actually causing people to die.
Yeah, because then it goes into who makes those ethics and what is their actual intention.
That leads me on to my very next question,
Oh.
which is how do you decide, how do we know what is right and what is wrong? That is, I suppose, the question. Who makes the ethics up? Who says that? How do you decide what is right? How do you decide what is wrong? How do you know whether making generic drugs in India? And those are questions which, individually, you will have to ask yourself for the basis of your own moral code, if you wish to have one. But ethically, those questions will be asked by society at large, or by professional organisations, or by institutes in academia who will answer in a different way to you, maybe, and provide an ethical code. So these are the kind of considerations you will need to give to try to determine some of the outcomes of some of these difficult, complex situations. Let me try and explain why this becomes important. One researcher has a guy called Robson on here, identified what he considered the 10 basic ethical dilemmas that people are faced with when they're doing research. So this is specifically to research now. And those 10 ethical dilemmas were involving these activities. When you do research, they may not involve activities of people, sometimes they do. And if they do, then these are the 10 items to look out for, because these are the ones which are of dubious or questionable or debatable practice. The first one was involving people without their knowledge or their consent. The second one was coercing them to participate, withholding information about the true nature of the research that you're doing. We've heard about that one in the past, and I think I talked about Stanley Milgram's experiment to do with obeying authority. Deceiving the participants, inducing them to commit acts diminishing their self-esteem, violating rights of self-determination, exposing them to physical or mental stress, invading their privacy, withholding benefits from some of them, and not treating them fairly with consideration or with respect. Those are the 10 items that Robson said are the kinds of things which are, as he puts it, questionable practices. Questionable practices. And when he calls them questionable practices, it does not mean that they are prohibited. It does not mean that you can't do those things. But you have to question whether you can do them or whether you should do them and have a good reason for it. Yes?
We have, well, specifically in social media and text and mining, we pretty much, probably most of those are covered within ethical dilemmas. But one of the things within social media is when they sign up to the page, the idea is that they sign up and they have a terms and conditions and they agree to the terms and conditions. And then it allows them to enable to use. Like,
that's the terms and conditions that no one ever reads, you mean?
Yeah, no one ever reads.
So the
So
firstborn will be sacrificed.
exactly, there could be anything on it. But in that sense, because we get a lot of Twitter data, we are using kind of the top one, which is involving people without their knowledge or consent, because we identified people or groups of people doing network analysis. We can figure out which people are the most widely retweeted out of all of them.
Yeah.
They don't know that specifically, and we can. So we're using their data with kind of without their knowledge or consent, but through
Do you know
them.
who they are?
I think it's actually Twitter's data, not theirs.
I think they give us consent to Twitter. Which
They put their data, they put their input to Twitter.
We know
But how does that
you're
publicise
Yeah,
that
but
data.
how does that filter out to us? Because we can use the Twitter API.
Yeah, you have
If
an
it's
account with
free.
Twitter. Twitter give you that account.
I
I don't
don't
think
we
it's
signed up for them.
But then they don't know what we use. That.
Just go rate their privacy, it doesn't matter.
Does this come back to the terms and conditions which they haven't read, presumably, which basically said Twitter can have all my data?
Yeah,
And therefore,
and provide
you don't
them
even
for
have
research.
copyright. You could put a poem on there, and I don't think you even have copyright.
No, it's presumably that when you sign up, it says all the data you put on here will be public.
Yeah.
But what's
Twitter,
the
anyone can-
data
otherwise
is
it wouldn't
public.
work, would it?
No, but ethically,
Yes.
what constraints around that? Is it fair enough to say that, oh, if you've read the terms and conditions and if you've ticked the terms and conditions without pretty much reading them, and then you've gone onto the website, is that ethically sound in the way of?
There's a question there between whether it's ethical or whether it's legal. I think legally it's okay because they've ticked the box, and therefore Twitter is covered by the fact that legally we've done the right thing. You can ask a different question though, is it ethical? Because we know that most people don't read these kind of things and don't know much about it.
Yeah.
So that might be a different question with a
Because
different answer.
You can focus down even to where they're located and
Yeah.
who they are. And
I'll be talking about that in a minute.
To come back to what I said before, we can observe that older people concerned more about their private data on social media, and young people less. So we can think that as the time goes by, young people and teenagers don't care about how we use their data on social media. So maybe some years after, could be ethical, totally ethical, to use that kind of data. So can we change our research now about social media and data who provided there?
Well, the difficulty with your statement, I think, is that you lump all young people together as if they're all the same, and they may not have all the same views.
Yeah.
The other thing is you're not too sure either why it is that young people in general, or on average, have very little concern about their privacy. It may be simply because they are young. And if it is to do with the fact that they are young, then when they become old, they may have a different view.
Yes, that's maybe it's a part of the modern life, and maybe in the future it's something totally ethical and totally acceptable.
But we don't know about the future.
Yeah, that's
Also, it's probably not. I don't know how they get around it. They probably get around it somehow. But if there's a young person under the age of, say, 16, or under the age of 18,
Yes.
and they sign up to terms and conditions on a website, well, they can't sign up for a mobile phone contract. So what makes it then the terms and conditions on the website is a contract. So they're not old enough to actually form or make that contract.
I think
So
the
how does that
website
work?
have got an age limit actually.
Yeah, but in law, I don't know how old you have to be before you can actually.
Sometimes I think it is 18, but very often it's governed by the fact that in order to complete the contract, usually they require you to have a credit card of some nature, and therefore the age check has been done by someone else, usually your bank, so that they rely on that. I've often seen that kind of thing promoted.
Depends what you're doing with the data pool. If you're
Yeah,
going to
like Twitter, though, if you obviously there's a lot of young people on Twitter under the age of 18, but they're actually ticking the box saying I agree with these terms and conditions, which is kind of forms a contract between Twitter and those teenagers or even younger. So if they're not able to form a contract in terms of mobile phone, when they actually sign up to Twitter,
get married and join the army at 16.
oh yeah, yeah.
That age is just arbitrary.
So I don't know how that works, because usually you have to have parental consent.
You do for some things, but not for other things.
And it's like the lines are blurred if it's ethical to do that or not, because maybe it's not ethical to say that you can go onto this website. You have to have parental consent before you can go onto these websites.
I think as far as your research, I would be concerned, is that because your situation, or is it not an ethical research?
How do you know? How do you know who they leave with?
You don't know who they are. You just know whether they leave alone or whether they leave with someone.
For what purpose? That's about the research. Just that.
Sorry?
For what purpose is that research? It's if they're good for the humanity. And
Research
the
is done
phrase is
for a
discovered.
whole range of different reasons, some of which are most bizarre.
For me, it depends. It's about the reason. If it's just for pleasure, it's not ethical. But if it's for a common good of the humanity,
I think that's fine.
That's fine.
Banks do it all
and
the time.
of course the face should be covered.
I want a yes or no then. How many people think it's okay? How many people think it's not okay? One, two.
Is it personally identifiable who they are, or is it just one person?
Exactly.
No, not
That's a good
identifying who
question.
they are.
Bouncers do it all the time.
Who do?
Bouncers.
Bouncers do it all the time.
Because they have clickers when they come into the club, because they want to know how many people are in the club, because
But
you can have a certain amount of.
That's their job, and that's within the condition of you going to the
But you don't-
capacity of the place and everything.
Yeah, but they
So
don't tell
it's-
you they're doing it.
Is it ethical or not ethical? The answer is yes, it is ethical, simply because this is a public place, it's public. I think this is the last of the ones here. I'm going to turn my sheet over. This is research into defensiveness, defensive behaviour. While